I was just a small lad, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, when the peculiar truth of Oakhaven first truly dawned on me. Not that I hadn't seen it, mind you. It was as plain as the gnarled oak that stood sentinel at the village's western edge, a tree whose branches, people said, had seen more tears than rain. But seeing and understanding are two vastly different things, especially when you're a child, and the adults around you shroud everything in hushed tones and knowing glances. Oakhaven, my home, was a village unlike any other, a place whispered about in hushed tones by merchants passing through, their horses shying away from our ancient moss-covered stone walls. It wasn't our humble cottages, nor our modest farmlands that drew their wary gazes, but a singular, unsettling anomaly. Oakhaven possessed a sprawling, well-tended cemetery, its weathered gravestones dating back centuries, yet not a single church spire pierced our sky. Every other village, town, or hamlet my father spoke of, from the bustling port of Silver Creek to the quiet farming community of Willow's Bend, had a church. A grand edifice, perhaps, with stained glass windows depicting saints and miracles, or a humble chapel of rough-hewn stone where the faithful gathered. Not Oakhaven. Here, the dead rested beneath the sprawling boughs of ancient trees, their final resting places marked by crosses and intricately carved angels. But the living sought solace, if they sought it at all, in the quiet solitude of their own hearths, or perhaps in the unspoken communion of shared silence on market days. Our graveyard, a place where shadow and sunlight played tricks among the forgotten names, was a testament to lives lived and lost, a silent city of the departed. It was always full, always accepting new residents, its earth ever ready to embrace another weary soul. Yet, no hymns ever echoed from a central place of worship, no bells ever chimed for Sunday service, no priest ever stood at an altar. The graves faced east, as they should, awaiting the dawn of a new day, but their silent vigil was uninterrupted by formal ceremony. My earliest memories are intertwined with the cemetery. My grandmother, a woman whose smile was as warm as fresh-baked bread, but whose eyes held a deep ancient sorrow, would often take me there. Not to grieve, not always, but to tend to the graves of ancestors I never knew, to pluck stray weeds from between the cracks of crumbling headstones, to trace the faded inscriptions with her gnarled finger. She never spoke much about why there was no church. Whenever I'd muster the courage to ask, her lips would press into a thin line, and she'd simply say, "Some things, little one, are best left undisturbed. The earth remembers more than we ever speak." Her words, simple as they were, always carried a weight that hushed my childish curiosity, at least for a time. The air in the cemetery was always different, too. Not chilling, not exactly, but thick, as if laden with unspoken stories. The rustle of leaves sounded like whispers, and the distant caw of a crow felt like a solemn pronouncement. It wasn't frightening, not to me, not then. It was simply Oakhaven. As I grew, my questions became more insistent, fueled by stories from traveling peddlers who brought news from the outside world. They spoke of grand cathedrals and powerful bishops, of community feasts after Sunday Mass, of festivals celebrating saints. I would listen, wide-eyed, trying to imagine such a place in our midst. Why were we different? What terrible secret kept us from building a house for God? Was it a curse, a defiance, a punishment? My father, a man of few words but strong hands, would only sigh and shake his head. "We are what we are, son, and we've always been." He believed in hard work and quiet resilience, not in questioning the long-established ways of Oakhaven. His faith, if he had one, was a private matter, expressed in the careful tending of his crops and the sturdy construction of our home. He seemed to see no contradiction in the presence of so many dead and the absence of a place to pray for their souls, or indeed for our own. The graveyard was not merely a place of rest. It was, in a strange way, the heart of Oakhaven. Children played tag among the older leaning stones, their laughter echoing eerily between the monuments. Lovers met there in the twilight, seeking the quiet intimacy afforded by the silent witnesses. Even important village meetings, usually concerning crop yields or the shared upkeep of the bridge over the Whispering River, were sometimes held on the smooth, flat stones near the ancient oak, as if the very ancestors buried beneath could lend their wisdom. It was a place of life, despite being a place of death. But the lack of a church, that gaping void in our spiritual landscape, always hovered. It was a silent accusation, a question mark etched into the very fabric of our existence. Some said it was a choice made long ago, a defiance against a tyrannical church authority. Others whispered of a terrible event, a sacrilege so profound that the land itself rejected any holy structure. No one knew for sure, or perhaps no one dared to speak the full truth aloud. The older folk simply pointed to the cemetery, a silent shrug of their shoulders, as if the very presence of so many graves without a church was explanation enough. Our village traditions were woven around this absence. Burials were solemn affairs, performed by the villagers themselves. The deceased would be carried on a simple wooden bier, their face uncovered, through the village streets. There would be no priest, no formal eulogy, just the quiet procession, the mournful keening of the women, and the silent, heavy gaze of the men. The body would be lowered into the earth, and then a single person, usually a close relative, would step forward and speak a few words, a brief memory, a shared hope, a quiet farewell. Then the earth would be returned, the mound carefully shaped, and a new stone, freshly carved, would stand beside the old. It was a raw, unfiltered kind of grief, unmediated by ritual or doctrine. It made death very real, very present. It made the cemetery not just a place, but a concept, a constant reminder of our mortality and our self-reliance. It felt, to a young boy's mind, both strangely liberating and profoundly unsettling. I remember once during a harsh winter when the snow lay thick upon the ground, muffling all sound, a traveling priest, lost and seeking shelter, stumbled into Oakhaven. He was a kindly man, his face etched with concern, his robes tattered from the journey. When he inquired about our church, the villagers exchanged uneasy glances. My father, with his usual stoicism, simply gestured towards the cemetery. The priest, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and dismay, looked from the countless crosses to the empty space where a church should have stood. He stayed for a few days, observing our quiet customs, his brow perpetually furrowed. He offered to hold a service, but the villagers, politely but firmly, declined. "We have our own ways, Father," my grandmother had said, her voice soft but resolute. He left soon after, his departure as quiet as his arrival, and I never saw another man of the cloth in Oakhaven again. His presence, brief as it was, only deepened the mystery for me. It was proof that our ways were not universal, that our village was an anomaly, a strange island in a sea of belief. The mystery of the absent church was not a topic of open discussion in Oakhaven, but it was a pervasive undercurrent, shaping our lives in subtle ways. We were a self-sufficient people, relying on our own strength and wit to navigate the harsh realities of life. Perhaps the lack of a central spiritual authority fostered this independence. We had no one to tell us how to pray, what to believe, or how to mourn. Each family, each individual, found their own path to solace or understanding. It meant that superstition often filled the void left by formal religion. Whispers of ancient spirits, of nature's benevolent or wrathful moods, of ancestral blessings, and curses were more common than Bible verses. My grandmother, for instance, always left a small bowl of milk out on the porch at night for the wee folk. and my father would always scatter a handful of grain to the four winds before planting. These were our rituals, our ways of appeasing the unseen forces that governed our lives. They were born of necessity, of a need to make sense of a world without a guiding light from a church. And so, the cemetery stood as a silent monument, not just to the dead, but to the living, to our unique and perplexing identity as the village with a cemetery but no church. I often wondered, as I lay in bed, staring at the shadows dancing on my ceiling, what secret the ground beneath our feet truly held, and why it refused to bear the weight of a church. It was a question that lingered, a silent companion to my growing years in Oakhaven. As the seasons turned and I grew from a small lad to a gangly youth, the unspoken questions about Oakhaven's peculiarity began to take on a more urgent edge. It wasn't just the quiet observations anymore, but a gnawing curiosity that fed on. The sparse conversations of the elders and the occasional, almost accidental, slips of information. The cemetery, once a familiar playground, started to feel like a massive open book, filled with pages I couldn't quite read. Every gravestone, every weathered cross seemed to hold a piece of the story, if only I knew how to coax it out. My grandmother, bless her heart, was still my most frequent companion there, her hands as steady as ever in their weeding, her silence as profound. But now, I saw the silence not as a barrier, but as a challenge. I wanted to know the story behind the story, the root of Oakhaven's strange, churchless existence. My father, practical as ever, found my persistent questioning tedious. He'd often send me to help with the plowing or mending fences, hoping that honest labor would displace what he likely considered idle speculation. But even as my hands calloused and my muscles strengthened, my mind continued to wander to the mystery. The whispers among the villagers were like fragments of a shattered mirror, each reflecting a different, incomplete image. Some spoke of an ancient plague that had swept through centuries ago, so virulent and indiscriminate that no priest dared to enter, leaving the dead unblessed and the living bereft of spiritual guidance. They said the earth itself had been scarred by the suffering, making it unfit for a house of God. Others hinted at a powerful, defiant ancestor, a chieftain or a wise woman, who had, for reasons unknown, forbidden the building of a church, perhaps, in protest against a distant, oppressive religious authority that sought to impose its will on our free-spirited people. This tale always intrigued me most, sparking images of a fierce, independent Oakhaven standing against the tide of conformity. Then, there were the darker murmurs, the ones that sent shivers down my spine on a moonless night. These tales spoke of a terrible sacrilege committed on the very ground where a church was once attempted. A desecration so profound, so heinous, that divine wrath had descended, striking down the builders and crumbling the foundations. They whispered of unholy rituals, of pacts made in shadow, of a darkness that had seeped into the very soil, making it impossible for any sacred structure to stand. This version was less popular, spoken only in the deepest shadows, by those with eyes that seemed to have seen too much. It was the kind of story that parents would hush their children about, turning their heads away as if the mere mention could invoke unseen malevolence. I would lie awake, listening to the wind howl outside, imagining unseen forces recoiling from the sanctity of a church, forever repelled by Oakhaven's dark secret. One sweltering summer afternoon, as I was helping my father harvest wheat, the old man Silas, whose back was as bent as the ancient oak and whose eyes held the wisdom of countless years, paused for a drink of water. He saw me staring at the distant cemetery, a small pensive figure against the shimmering heat haze. Silas had a reputation for knowing things, for remembering the old ways and the old stories that others had forgotten or chosen to suppress. "Still wondering about the absence, young one," he rasped, his voice like dry leaves rubbing together. I nodded, my heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and trepidation. This was my chance. Silas took a long draught, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and sat heavily on a fallen log. "It wasn't a single event, lad," he began, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if seeing beyond the fields, into the mists of time. "It was a series of choices, a defiance born of necessity, nurtured by a deep distrust. Our ancestors, the first to settle this valley, were a stubborn folk. They prized their freedom above all else. When the High Church, from the grand city beyond the mountains, sent its emissaries, demanding tithes and adherence to their laws, our forefathers resisted. Not with swords and spears, mind you, but with quiet, unyielding refusal. They believed the divine resided in the rustle of the leaves, the flow of the river, the silent vigil of the stars, not within walls of stone and stained glass. They saw the church as another form of dominion, another master seeking to bind them. Silas paused, his eyes twinkling with a faint, distant fire. "They tried to build a church once, in the very early days. A small one, a compromise, perhaps to appease the emissaries who threatened them with damnation. But every time, the foundations would shift. The stones would crumble, the timber would warp and crack, no matter how sturdy. Some said it was the work of nature, the restless earth rejecting the foreign structure. Others said it was the spirits of the land, the ancient guardians, refusing to yield their sacred ground to an imposed faith. My own grandmother, she told me, it was the spirit of the old oak itself, angered by the carving of its kin for lumber. He chuckled, a dry wheezing sound. Eventually, the builders gave up. They saw it as a sign, a clear message from the land itself. Here, you will find peace with the earth, but not with rigid doctrine. This was a new perspective, one that resonated deeply within me. Not a curse, not a sacrilege, but a defiant choice, a spiritual rebellion. "So, they chose the cemetery over the church?" I asked, trying to grasp the magnitude of such a decision. Silas nodded slowly. "They chose the living over the institution. They chose the earth over the altar. They understood that death was part of life, and that the honoring of the departed was a sacred duty, one that didn't require a priest or grand ceremonies. The graveyard became their temple, a place where their ancestors watched over them, a constant reminder of their roots and their unique path. It was a silent testament to their independence, a monument to their refusal to be bound by outside authority. Each burial was a reaffirmation of their commitment to Oak Haven and its distinct identity." He went on to explain how, over generations, this practice solidified. The village thrived, unmolested by the powerful church, which eventually turned its gaze to more populous and compliant lands. Oak Haven, with its mysterious absence of a church, became a legend, a place best left alone, a quiet enigma. The fact that the village continued to prosper, despite lacking the formal blessings of the church, only deepened the legend and reinforced the villagers' belief in their unique way. They had found their own form of reverence, their own path, to spiritual connection, not through dogma and ritual, but through the cycles of nature, the bonds of family, and the quiet dignity of their departed. The cemetery was not a place of fear, but of reverence, a vast, open-air cathedral where every grave was a pew and every rustle of leaves was a whispered prayer. It was a place where generations of Oak Haven folk, from the founding families to the newest infants, lay side by side, united in their quiet rebellion. Listening to Silas, the pieces of the puzzle began to click into place. The hushed tones weren't just about a secret, but about a shared understanding, a collective memory passed down through generations. The weary glances of passing merchants weren't just fear, but perhaps a mixture of confusion and a grudging respect for our peculiar self-sufficiency. The old oak, my constant companion in the cemetery, was not just a tree, but a living symbol of Oak Haven's deep roots and enduring spirit. It stood silent and steadfast, like our ancestors, watching over us, guiding us, without the need for sermons or stained glass. The cemetery, in its vastness and eternal silence, was the true heart of Oak Haven, a testament to a people who chose a different path, a path etched in stone and nurtured by the earth itself. The mystery was still there, but now it was a mystery I could almost understand, a legacy I was beginning to embrace as my own. It was a story not of a curse, but of a quiet, profound freedom. The understanding I gained from Silas didn't erase the mystery of Oak Haven, but it transformed it. What was once a bewildering void, a perplexing anomaly, now felt like a badge of honor, a quiet rebellion etched into the very soil beneath our feet. My walks through the cemetery, once tinged with childish wonder and vague unease, became pilgrimages. I no longer saw just gravestones, but the silent witnesses to generations of quiet defiance. Each crooked marker, each faded inscription, whispered tales of an independence that ran as deep as the roots of the ancient oak. I would spend hours tracing the names, imagining the lives they had led, the choices they had made, and the strength it must have taken to forge a path so different from the world outside our valley. My grandmother, noticing my newfound absorption in the cemetery, would sometimes watch me with a knowing smile, her eyes reflecting a satisfaction that transcended words. She never spoke of Silas's revelations, but her gestures, her lingering touch on my shoulder as we walked among the graves, conveyed a silent approval. It was as if she knew I was finally beginning to truly see Oak Haven, not as a place defined by an absence, but by a powerful presence. The traditions of our village, which once seemed merely quaint or practical, now held deeper meaning. The silent burials, the personal farewells spoken over open graves, the absence of priests. These were not omissions, but deliberate acts, woven into the fabric of our identity. They were the threads of Oak Haven's spirit, passed down from one generation to the next as resilient and unyielding as the granite of our oldest headstones. As I approached adolescence, the whispers of the outside world grew louder. More merchants passed through, some less wary than before, bringing not just goods but stories. They spoke of burgeoning cities, of grand new churches, of crusades and holy wars waged in distant lands, all in the name of God and the High Church. These tales often painted Oak Haven as an oddity, a curious backwater, perhaps even a place touched by darkness, given our lack of a visible spiritual center. Sometimes their words held a note of pity, sometimes of disdain. But I found myself no longer bothered by their judgments. Instead, a quiet pride swelled within me. Let them pity us for our perceived lack. We possessed a freedom they could only dream of, a connection to the earth and our ancestors that no grand cathedral could ever truly offer. This sense of Oak Haven's unique identity became central to how I viewed the world. While other villages might draw strength from a shared doctrine, we drew ours from the land, from the unbreakable bonds of family, and from a history of self-reliance. We faced the harsh winters and the lean harvests, not with prayers to a distant deity mediated by a priest, but with the collective effort of our community, with the wisdom passed down from generations of farmers and craftsmen. If a child fell ill, our mothers and grandmothers would gather herbs from the forest, their knowledge honed by centuries of practical experience, rather than seek blessings from a holy man. When disputes arose, they were settled by village elders, their decisions rooted in common sense and a deep understanding of our community's needs, not by religious decree. The cemetery, in a profound way, served as our communal memory and our moral compass. It reminded us of those who came before, of their struggles and their triumphs. It was a silent admonition against selfishness, against actions that would bring dishonor to the family names etched in stone. To walk among those graves was to walk with history, to feel the weight of generations who had chosen this path, who had found their peace not in a church, but in the embrace of the earth they had tilled and protected. It was a powerful lesson in continuity, a silent promise that our ways would endure, as long as the oak stood and the river flowed. One day, a group of young men from a neighboring village, emboldened by too much ale and perhaps a sense of misguided religious superiority, ventured into Oakhaven. They had heard the whispers, the stories of our churchless existence, and came to enlighten us. They stood near the market square, shouting about damnation and the fires of hell, demanding that we build a proper church and renounce our pagan ways. The older villagers watched them with quiet, weary eyes, their faces etched with centuries of resilience. My father, along with several other men, simply stood, arms crossed, their gazes as unyielding as stone. There was no aggression in their stance, only an immovable refusal to be swayed. The young men grew more agitated, their voices rising in volume, their insults more pointed. It was then that my grandmother, a small figure yet possessed of immense presence, stepped forward. She didn't shout, she didn't argue. She simply raised a hand, her voice, though soft, carrying an authority that silenced the brash youths. "Young men," she said, her gaze calm but unwavering, "you speak of God and of a house for him. Look around you." She swept her arm, indicating the sprawling village, the carefully tended fields, the sturdy homes. Then her arm extended further, pointing towards the western edge, where the ancient oak stood sentinel over the silent city of the dead. "We have always believed the divine is everywhere. It is in the sunrise that brings warmth to our crops, in the river that feeds our lands, in the very earth that cradles our ancestors." Her voice grew a little stronger, filled with a quiet passion. "And for a house of remembrance, a place to honor those who came before, we have this." She gestured emphatically towards the cemetery. "A grander cathedral you will never find. It holds the stories of every soul who has ever called Oakhaven home. No walls can contain such history, no roof can cover such a vast testament to life and loss." The young men, initially scoffing, slowly fell silent, their eyes drawn to the ancient, sprawling cemetery, its stones catching the afternoon sun. The sheer scale of it, its undeniable presence, seemed to strike them. It wasn't just a burial ground, it was a sprawling, living chronicle. They left soon after, not in a blaze of defiance, but with a bewildered quietness. They had come to preach, but had encountered a faith, or a philosophy, that was too deeply ingrained, too intrinsically tied to the land to be easily shaken. Their concept of God and worship was confined within walls. Ours was boundless, woven into the very fabric of our existence. It was a pivotal moment for me. I saw with my own eyes the power of Oakhaven's unique identity, a power that needed no sermons or grand pronouncements. It simply was. This incident cemented my understanding. The lack of a church was not a deficit, but a definition. It shaped our values, our resilience, our unwavering connection to our past and to the land. We were not godless. We simply found our spirituality in a different form, a more ancient, earthbound, and deeply personal way. The cemetery was our sacred ground, a place of peace, memory, and enduring spirit. It stood not in opposition to faith, but as its own profound expression. And as I continued to grow, I knew that this unique legacy, this quiet strength of Oakhaven, was something I would carry with me. A silent testament to the village with a cemetery, but no church. It was a heritage passed down not through written doctrine, but through the silent wisdom of the land and the unwavering spirit of its people. My understanding of Oak Haven's peculiar existence deepened with each passing year. The cemetery, once a place of quiet reflection, became my classroom. Not for letters or sums, though I learned those too from my grandmother's patient tutelage, by the flickering hearth light, but for the true lessons of life and loss, of resilience and the subtle power of collective memory. I learned to read the stories etched in stone, not just the names and dates, but the implied narratives of triumph and tragedy, of love and sorrow that these silent markers held. Some stones were grand, painstakingly carved with intricate patterns, suggesting a family of means or deep affection. Others were simple, rough-hewn, bearing only a name and a year, hinting at lives lived with quiet dignity or, perhaps, cut short too soon. Yet, they all rested together, side by side, united in the embrace of the earth, just as the living villagers were united in their shared traditions and unique way of life. The concept of a church began to feel foreign, almost an abstract notion, from a distant, less tangible world. Why would one need walls of stone to feel close to something so vast and omnipresent as the divine? The rising sun that painted the eastern sky each morning, the moon that cast long dancing shadows through, the ancient oak, the very soil that yielded our sustenance. These were our sacred texts, our living scriptures. The wind whispering through the branches of the cemetery trees became our hymns, the silent vigil of the gravestones our sermons. It was a faith rooted in observation, in the tangible rhythms of nature, and in the enduring legacy of those who had walked this earth before us. It felt more honest, more real, than the tales of grand cathedrals and distant deities that merchants sometimes spun. My grandmother, with her gentle wisdom, began to share more explicit details of Oak Haven's past, as if sensing my readiness to bear the weight of its history. She spoke of the Great Forgetting, a time centuries ago when a severe drought had gripped the land, threatening to wipe out the fledgling settlement. The crops withered, the river dwindled to a trickle, and despair settled like a shroud over the valley. Prayers to the high church, conveyed through distant emissaries, seemed to fall on deaf ears. No miracles appeared, no relief was granted. It was then, she explained, that the people of Oak Haven turned inward, to their own ingenuity and to the ancient knowledge of the land itself. They dug deeper wells, channeled what little water remained, and nurtured their most resilient seeds with desperate care. They learned to rely solely on themselves and on each other. "It was not a defiance born of arrogance, little one," she'd say, her voice soft as a lullaby but firm in its conviction. It was a defiance born of abandonment, when the church offered no succor, when its promises rang hollow against the gnawing hunger. Our ancestors learned that true strength came from within and from the earth that sustained them. They learned that the spirits of their departed kin, buried in this very soil, were more present, more comforting than any distant saint. The cemetery became a symbol of their survival, a testament to their enduring spirit, even in the face of desolation. This was a new layer to the story, a profound reason for Oak Haven's separation, not just a philosophical choice, but a practical one forged in the crucible of hardship. The Great Forgetting left an indelible mark on Oak Haven. It instilled in the villagers a deep-seated self-reliance and a healthy skepticism towards external authorities, especially those that promised salvation but delivered only empty words. This historical memory, passed down through generations, solidified the village's commitment to its unique path. We had no need for formal religious institutions because our history had taught us that our true faith lay in our hands, our community, and the earth that sustained us. The cemetery was the living monument to this hard-won lesson, a silent reminder of what happens when one relies on promises rather than the tangible reality of one's own efforts. My boyhood friendships were forged in this unique crucible. We played among the gravestones, not with disrespect, but with a natural ease, as if the departed were simply silent, benevolent observers. We learned to track deer through the ancient woods, to fish in the whispering river, to identify edible plants and healing herbs. Our elders taught us practical skills, and our shared history taught us resilience. There were no Sundays for sermons, no forced attendance at rituals that felt detached from our lives. Our spiritual education came from observing the seasons, from understanding the delicate balance of nature, and from learning the stories of our ancestors, passed down by word of mouth, by touch, by shared silence in the quiet solitude of the graveyard. I recall one crisp autumn morning when the leaves were a riot of gold and crimson. A young peddler, new to these parts, sat with us by the village well. He was a talkative fellow, full of tales from the bustling cities and the grand world beyond. He spoke of his own village, boasting of its magnificent new church, its gleaming altar, and the powerful bishop who visited regularly. He seemed genuinely bewildered by Oakhaven's lack of one. "But where do you go to cleanse your sins?" he asked, his brow furrowed with genuine concern. "Where do you seek salvation? How do you prepare for the afterlife?" My father, typically taciturn, simply looked at the peddler, then at the vast expanse of the cemetery visible in the distance. "We live our lives," he said, his voice quiet but firm, "with honor and purpose. We tend to our families, we work our lands, we help our neighbors, and when our time comes, we return to the earth that bore us. Our ancestors await us there. We believe that a life well lived is its own salvation, and the earth itself is our witness." The peddler, unaccustomed to such simple, profound statements, blinked, momentarily speechless. He had expected an argument, perhaps a defensive explanation, but not such an unshakable declaration of faith in a different way. He could not comprehend a spirituality unmediated by ornate structures or official clergy. His world was one of hierarchy and ritual. Ours was one of earth and self-reliance. He looked from my father's calm, weathered face to the silent, sprawling cemetery, and for the first time, I saw not pity or disdain in a stranger's eyes, but a flicker of true bewilderment, perhaps even a hint of awe. He had encountered a truth that lay beyond the boundaries of his own understanding. The incident reaffirmed my conviction in Oakhaven's unique path. We weren't lost souls in need of saving. We were simply different. Our faith was interwoven with the very fabric of our daily lives, expressed in the sweat of honest labor, the warmth of family bonds, and the quiet reverence for the earth that held our past and nourished our future. The cemetery was not a place of dread, but a sacred ground, a peaceful continuum where the living and the dead shared a silent, profound understanding. It was our enduring symbol, a testament to generations who had chosen a path of self-determination, a quiet, defiant truth that resonated deeply within my own growing spirit. As I matured, I knew that this peculiar legacy was not a burden, but a gift, a heritage of freedom and connection to a spirituality as ancient and unyielding as the land itself.